All right, welcome back for the last but not least panel of the day on global trade and inclusive economies. It's a pleasure to have such a great panel, and I'll leave it to Dr. Daniel Musica, President and CEO of the Conference Board of Canada, to introduce the topic and the panel. Over to you, Daniel.
Well, thank you very much. So, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
That was good. I won't send you off to practice that again. But welcome to the final plenary, which is, of course, on the question of global trade and the economics of diversity. We do live in a really interesting time when it comes to the question of global trade, and a contradictory time as we see it. We've seen a massive evolution in the system of global trade and finance over the last 50 years. And arguably, the global trading system that we put in place and finance system that we put in place has been the largest mover of people out of poverty in human history. Some calculations say that it's 1 billion or so have been brought out of extreme poverty through global trade and their participation in it. And it's also been associated in a number of cases with higher levels of inclusion and diversity, though not universally. That said, of course, what we're witnessing today is that some segments of the world population are pushing back on global trade and its benefits, basically looking at it and saying, hey, we've been left behind. And there is some economic evidence that, in fact, certain segments in the developed world have actually been left behind, and we're seeing a surge in populism as a result. We are keenly aware in looking at these topics that we are the last panel between you and freedom. And it's been, I think, a long and full day. How many of you feel you've been drinking from a fire hose all day? Several people have their hands up. But that said, we have a keenly interesting panel and many ideas to contribute to really address a number of questions. First is it continuing increase in global trade a good thing? Is it a force for good? Is it a force for continuing to create an improvement in the global economy and society? Does it aid in improving diversity and inclusion? And how can it do better at that? And what can Canada's role be in this? So the panelists today that we have one virtual panelist who's online. I can see him, you can't, but you will in a moment, is Mr. David Usher, who's the Director General of Trade Negotiations at Global Affairs Canada. And he is joining us by video conference. I presume from Ottawa, but given all the negotiations going on, it could be from anywhere. He's nodding that it is Ottawa. Mr. JALOUL, who's the former Minister of Finance of Tunisia and President of MED Confederation and Vice President of Euromed Capital Forum. Dr. Juan-José Daboub, who is the former Managing Director of the World Bank and former Finance Minister of El Salvador, now Chairman and CEO of the Daboub Partnership, Vice Chairman of the Dorado Group and founding CEO of the Global Adaptation Institute. Dr. Eva Busza, who is VP of Research and Programs of the Asia Pacific Foundation. Welcome, Eva. And my friend, the Honorable Yuen who's Senator of Canada and former head of the Asia Pacific Foundation. So we want to welcome them. Please join me in welcoming them. So I'm going to charge right into it and ask David to, in fact, join us from Ottawa. And here comes David. That isn't David. Here comes David. That's David. And
excellent. Wow. Thank you. That is me on big screen.
So you'll be talking to us about Canada's view on the value of global trade, Canada's trade agenda. David, over to you.
Excellent. So I hope everybody can hear me. I am calling in from wintry Ottawa today. So if you can hear me, just nod your head, please.
We can hear you.
Good. Excellent. Okay. So I'm going I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do better here at Global Affairs, and more specifically, our progressive trade agenda. And I would argue that our progressive trade agenda supports both the forum's theme of promoting diversity and inclusion, and also this panel's focus on promoting inclusive economies. So I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about what this progressive trade idea means for the government of Canada, and maybe give you a little bit of context. You alluded to it already in your introduction about growing concerns over trade and globalization.
David, if you could, you're breaking up a little bit. It's a little bit hard to hear you. If you could maybe move the mic closer, or
okay. How's that?
That's better. Now we only see your eyes, but that's okay.
Yeah, it's hard to have both at once here. So we've seen concerns over globalization. We've had that expressed in concerns in Europe over CETA and the TTIP negotiations with the U.S. We've seen it in the context of the U.S. Presidential campaign. And during the same period when we saw these growing concerns, we were doing particularly intensive consultations with Canadians about our trade and investment policy. And, we've heard concerns domestically about lack of transparency in the negotiations process, perception that benefits are going to larger companies, that certain elements of the segments of the population have been negatively affected, and, perceived threats to the environment, health, safety, consumer standards, and government's right to regulate. And we could have a debate about whether the real problem is technological change or trade, but to some extent, the cause doesn't matter, because if the belief is that trade is the problem, then this concern needs to be addressed. And the government has realized that we need to do more, not only to ensure that Canadians understand the benefits of trade, but that the benefits are shared more broadly within Canadian society. I think we all know how important trade is for Canada. Even though we're only 0.5% of the world's population, we have 2.2% of the share of world trade, and trade accounts for more than 60% of our GDP. So for us, it's very important to not only build and sustain support for an open rules-based trading system in Canada, but also internationally. And we need to talk about trade and do trade in a way that Canadians can see and feel that works for them. Now, when we talk about ensuring the benefits of trade are more broadly shared within Canada, a lot of that depends on the so-called flanking policies, unemployment insurance, education, tax policy, and those are outside of both my expertise and my responsibility. But when we turn to trade policy, what we're looking at is how to bring the benefits of what we negotiate to a broader range of Canadians. Part of that is through consultations and ensuring that we consult more broadly with what we might call non-traditional stakeholders, whether that be labor movements or small and medium-sized enterprises, Indigenous groups, women-owned organizations, and youth. It's also very important that we report back to Canadians on what we are learning as a result of consultations. And for those of you that are following global affairs closely, we've recently published reports on consultations on our with Canadians on China and a potential FTA with China. Second element of trade policy that we're looking at is how to introduce progressive content into our trade agreements. We've done that for some time. If you remember the NAFTA agreement in '94, we had side letters on labor and the environment. We've included those in our FTA since then, but we're also going further with additional progressive elements, whether it's trade and gender or provisions to deal with small and medium-sized enterprises. I guess the other element is international engagement. And how do we work to not only advance the progressive trade agenda in Canada, but also multilaterally? and we're doing that in the context of the WTO, the OECD, G20, APEC, with like-minded partners. For example, we have an upcoming WTO ministerial meeting in Buenos Aires, and Canada, with other members, is supporting a declaration on women's economic empowerment that we hope will be endorsed by a group of members in Buenos Aires in December. So, very quickly, if I may, Chair, some specific ideas here. I talked about gender, and traditionally we've thought that trade is gender neutral, but we realize that that is not the case. Obviously, gender distribution in different sectors of the economy varies, and liberalization in those sectors has different gender effects. So we're beginning to think about how to incorporate gender-related provisions in FTAs, and our most recent example is Canada-Chile, which was signed in June of this year, where we included for the first time a trade and gender chapter. This was also the first for any G20 country. We've also tabled a trade and gender chapter in the context of the NAFTA negotiations, and are working hard with our Mexican and American colleagues to try to make that happen. Let me give you a specific example of what we're doing in the context of the WTO. There's a working party on domestic regulations. One proposal that Canada has put forward is that if you regulate your professions, you need to ensure that those professional regulations do not discriminate on the basis of gender. So, for example, women should be able to practice law or engineering, and there should be nothing in your regulatory framework that prohibits that. Moving to SMEs, SMEs are very important not only in the Canadian economy but elsewhere, and we're working in the context of our negotiations to advance an SME chapter that aims to facilitate their access to trade and more specifically global value chains. And one good news element of the NAFTA discussions to date is that discussions have been substantially completed on an SME chapter in the new NAFTA negotiations. Last but not least, enhanced consultations. If I was going to give you an example on the context of NAFTA, since February of this year, we've received over 23,000 written submissions, and we've reached out to over 700 stakeholders across the country to hear their views and build relationships, and we will continue to do so through the negotiations. So the inclusive nature of not only the trade benefits, but the consultation process is important, and we're going to actively continue in that area. Let me stop there, because I know you've got a very distinguished panel with other clever things to say, and I'd welcome any questions people would have later.
Thank you very much. That gives us a broad basis to begin with and gives us a bit more focus. Sir Ed, what is your perspective on the evolution of global trade and the importance of some of the things that David's talked about?
All right, but before I answer your question, I'd like to say how delighted I'm, to be back in Victoria. I came to Victoria last January, following an invitation from my friend Professor Adel Gitouni, and I had a chance to meet with some of the faculty members of the business school and gave a few lectures to the students, and I fell in love with this place. So I'm glad to be back, even though it took me a 24-hour trip door to door, and not feeling lucky enough to be the last, to be in the last panel with a 9-hour jet lag, but I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you.
And thank you for the invitation. Let me start with two facts. The first fact is that it has been very clearly demonstrated that international trade and the dramatic increase of international trade over the last few decades had an impact on growth. But of course, it's a varying impact depending on what country you're talking about. I mean, the impact was much more noteworthy in the advanced economies and some of the large emerging markets such as China and India. So those countries that have economies that are export-led economies and have a strong integration in the global value chains stood a much better chance to take advantage and reap the benefits of this dramatic increase in international trade. The second fact is that growth is no panacea for inclusiveness. And the fact is that we see today in most countries that inequality is as high as it has ever been. And therefore, the inclusiveness aspect has not really figured as part of the cornerstone of policy formulations in most countries. I have yet to see a country that has set forth a comprehensive policy framework whereby the objective is inclusiveness. Growth is not an end in itself. Growth is a means to something more noble, and that something is inclusiveness and sustainability. And there was a study that was published earlier this year by the World Economic Forum, whereby they have attempted to put a comprehensive model whose objective is inclusiveness. This was published, I think, in January of this year, and they have built that model around 7 pillars and 15 sub-pillars. And I think it can be a source of inspiration for countries that wish to set forth a model, a comprehensive model, whereby inclusiveness is the objective. And if a country were to pursue that route, the question would be, what will be the appropriate channel for it to conduct that policy? I mean, what channels will the country will be using? And there are many channels, but the most important channel, in my judgment, is the MSME channel, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Why? Because in most countries, developed and emerging economies, MSMEs represent, by and large, the bulk of enterprises in the economic fabric or landscape of a country. In the emerging economies, they can go as high as 95% if you include both formal and informal enterprises. They account for about 60 to 70% of the labor force. I would say 50 to 70% of the labor force, 30 to 40% of GDP. And therefore, if you were to ensure inclusiveness, you have to address the MSME segment. And we have seen the important role that MSMEs have played in certain economies. What comes to mind are the Anatolian tigers in Turkey that actually became the driving force of the economy there. Now, of course, they fell out of favor of late because some of them supported the ill-fated coup attempt against Erdogan, but they are getting their steam back, and they really are the engine of growth in Turkey, and they're mostly composed of SMEs that have had a tremendous impact on increasing the Turkish exports. But other countries, or SMEs in other countries, have not been so lucky. I would submit that in most of Africa, the economies of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, even in North Africa, did not take advantage of the integration and the global value chain, and therefore did not benefit from this tremendous increase of trade, of international trade. SMEs, by definition, are embedded in the local market, and therefore they are attuned to local policies. And if the country does not put in place the right policies to promote exports and to encourage the SMEs to explore opportunities in the international markets, then they will just be looking around in the domestic market, and therefore the growth potential of SMEs will be limited, basically. Now, the WTO put in place a trade facilitation agreement, which was approved in 2013, and which came into effect in 2017, just a few months ago. And that was hailed as being a major victory for WTO, and it's an initiative that will help SMEs and will help emerging markets improve their integration into the international trade arena. But the jury is still out as to whether that will indeed be the case, and there are different opinions. Some people estimate that the main objective of the trade facilitation being that to reduce trade cost, the cost of trade, that there are hidden costs that if they are not addressed in country, then the effect of the trade facilitation agreement will be limited. And when I say hidden costs, I mean, for example, the hovering vessels. Sometimes they have to wait a long time before they can find a place in the port, infrastructure, the customs procedures, which sometimes are very heavy and very cumbersome. Those are the hidden costs that if they are not addressed, then obviously the trade facilitation agreement may not have the effect that people are hoping that it will have. So far this year, about 118 countries, if my information is correct, have already ratified that agreement, and we will see what will happen. My own judgment is that phase 2 of the trade facilitation agreement, which is Trade Facilitation Agreement 2.0, will probably have more impact as far as the SMEs are concerned, because it will include an e-commerce component to it. What that means is that the SMEs will have the possibility to sell directly to international market on a B2B basis or on a B2C basis. And if the countries are smart enough to put in place platforms, electronic e-commerce platforms that will help purchase products from the local producers and sell them to the international markets, the marketplaces, for example, the Amazon of this world, or eBay, or wherever, that will really give a boost to the produce and the products that are being produced by SMEs in the local markets. That said, I said that trade is a major determinant of growth, but there is another determinant which is probably even more important, and that is investment. We all know that investment is the backbone of any development program, and we also know that the gap today to reach the Millennium Development Goals, there is a gap of about $2.3, $2.5 trillion, that if we don't fill that gap, then we're not going to be reaching that goal. But more importantly, investment is and has been at the very top of the agenda of the WTO. And this started back in the Doha round. But I mean, many emerging countries, including China, Brazil, Russia, at that time, they were adamantly against it. However, today there is talk, there is the possibility that a new initiative is being launched again by the WTO to set forth an investment facilitation program. And those countries that were against it back in 2003, such as China and Brazil, are now in favor of that. And that shows something. It shows the changing power game in the trade picture in the world. That those countries that were considered to be emerging are now so powerful that they have a very heavy say in the trade negotiations, and they are pushing and pushing very hard. China, Brazil, and the MICTA countries, that is Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Australia, are in favor of putting the investment facilitation agreement again under the umbrella of the WTO. And the argument there is that trade and investment are two facets or two sides of the same coin, which is the development coin. Okay? However, some countries are adamantly against it. And those countries are, in particular, India, South Africa, most of the countries in Africa. I was in Abuja, actually, just a few days ago, and I have attended a high-level trade. I have been asked by the Tunisian Minister of Trade to go with him and attend this conference. And Nigeria is trying to enroll other countries out of Africa to support this initiative. And this initiative is supposed to be debated in the Buenos Aires ministerial meeting, which will take place in a few weeks between the 10th and the 13th of December. And my guess is that the talks about the investment facilitation will be informal, and that no agreement will be reached. And so the question is why? Why are those countries against investment facilitation? After all, if you can facilitate investment and promote cross-border investments between countries, that should be a good thing. Well, the argument is that that will infringe upon the policy space of those countries. That's one. And many countries believe that there are more important and practical issues that can be addressed prior to talking about investment facilitation, issues such as mobility, which is a major problem, issues such as the rules of origin, which if we can find a way to sort them out, that will facilitate investments. And that after all, investors, particularly the large investors, they will choose themselves the country where they would invest, and they will choose them basically based on how important their economies are and based on the purchasing power and other criteria.
Maybe we can come back to that again.
Yes.
Any other major points of
that? And so those are, I think, the two main variables that are being discussed now. And I believe personally that trade will continue to play an important role as far as inclusiveness is concerned. But the most important thing is that if you were to ensure inclusiveness, don't expect it to come from multilateral agreements. It will come from the in-country policies that governments will put in place to help, particularly MSMEs, access international markets.
Thank you for highlighting the roles of MSMEs, and thank you for the 9 hours of jet lag you're suffering. Mr. Daboub, what are your views?
So I'm going to address this from a slightly different angle and in a shorter period of time.
Sorry for it.
I don't have the jet lag. And I want to thank the organizers of the event. I have spent about 1/3 of my life in academia, about 1/3 in the public sector, and about 1/3 in the private sector. And as managing director of the World Bank, I was responsible for 110 countries around the world, all of Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. And the common thread, the common denominator in all of these countries is that people want an opportunity to take destiny into their own hands. They are fed up of governments, they are fed up of regulation, they are fed up of many of the things that in academia sometimes, in the public policy many times, in global organizations many times. We heard the first speaker talking about they are going to include in a free trade agreement more and more conditionality. So many of these agreements are no longer on free trade, but rather are a composition of, or an imposition of a lot of things that many times are not culturally adequate or are 25 years ahead of the reality of some of the countries you are talking to, or are simply impractical to put them into practice in a short period of time. By the time you make those changes, the world is 50 years ahead of you. We heard in the previous panel talking about the importance of climate change, but nobody spoke, for example, about Africa, where when you exclude South Africa, only 25% of the population have access to electricity. Are you going to tell them, wait, don't use your natural resources, wait until you can have some kind of alternative means? You cannot. That's not a way of including. That's actually a way of excluding. So, I do think that global trade has help more people come out of poverty. You indicated, Dan, at the beginning a number, which is about right, about 50% of the people who have lived out of poverty, primarily in China and in part in India, but also in Latin America. It's a direct consequence of the fact that that markets were open in a particular way. So I think it has worked. Has it worked and achieved its full potential? No, I think much more needs to be done. And it takes two to tango. So it takes certain work on the side of the markets or the larger economies, the richest economies. And it takes a lot of work in countries like mine, El Salvador and others, where you need to be able to remove the obstacles that are not allowing people to take destiny into their own hands. For example, I was a member of the negotiation of the free trade agreement between the Central American countries and the United States, NAFTA, and in other free trade agreements that were negotiated. And I think we haven't, in Central America, take full advantage of the opportunities of such agreement because we have not done many of the reforms that we need to do internally in order to have a more innovative and creative private sector, a more innovative and creative labor sector that is adequate to what the market demands and not what a bureaucrat sitting in an office thinks that these people need. So I think that the angle I want to address, and I want to hopefully with that motivate some questions or later some reflections, is that it is much better to have an imperfect market than a perfect bureaucrat telling us what to do. I also think that countries like, if I'm not mistaken, last night I heard that your family originally comes from Singapore.
Yes.
I am a big admirer of Singapore. I admire countries like Chile. There are New Zealand, Australia, I think are countries that have done great things. I admire Canada. I think Canada is one of those countries that has achieved levels of success in many metrics, while at the same time being very supportive of many other countries around the world. And so it is, in many areas, a model to follow. So countries like the ones in Central America or the other 110 countries that I worked with while I was at the World Bank Group have a lot of homework to do in order to capitalize fully on the opportunities that global trade means. So I want to leave that for now, respectful of the 5 minutes that I think it's enough to then have some questions and go into more detail.
Thank you. So better to have an imperfect market then.
It's better to have an imperfect market than a perfect bureaucrat telling us what to do.
Okay. Eva, you've done quite a bit of work and reflection on global trade and diversity and inclusion. I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to address this issue really from the Canada-Asia relationship. And what I'm going to try and argue to you is that as we look at greater engagement with Asia, we have a tremendous opportunity to get the kind of inclusive growth that we are all aspiring towards. But before I go there, let me just back up. I mean, we know that we're seeing greater protectionism, anti-global trade sentiments in many countries in the world. We also see, unfortunately, a rise of voices against diversity in many countries. But the good news, at least in Canada, and we know this from the polls that we do at the Asia Pacific Foundation, is that Canadians as a whole in the last couple of years have become much more open towards the idea of trade with Asia, and actually also open to more immigration, particularly of highly skilled economic workers. But that shouldn't make us complacent, because we also know that global sentiments can be quite contagious. So what's the vaccine? And the vaccine is really to look at those sectors of society that are most vulnerable. and ensure that they are not only the benefiters of global trade, but are also participants. And who are we talking about? Women, ethnic minorities, new immigrants, and indigenous peoples. So I'd just like to give some examples of how we can target those particular sectors to ensure that as we move forward with our engagement with Asia, they will be beneficiaries. So let me start with women. Women aged 15 and older account for 48% of the Canadian workforce. And it's estimated that closing the gender gap in Canada would increase our GDP by close to 10%. But we know from many studies that women face a number of unique challenges which hinder their participation and ascent in the workforce. That includes gender biases, lack of access to finance and networks, and difficulties juggling their work and domestic responsibilities. But in the context of our expanding engagement with Asia, one of the most promising areas of engagement for Canadians is the one that is actually particularly well suited to aspiring women entrepreneurs because it helps them mitigate or overcome these barriers. And I'm talking about e-commerce. We know that e-commerce is booming in Asia. The Asia-Pacific region is the largest market in the world with over $525 billion in business-to-consumer e-commerce sales. And many of you may have heard that just this week, Alibaba made $25.5 billion in sales on their e-commerce platforms.
In one day.
In one day. This is one day, Singles Day. So why is e-commerce so well suited to women? Well, because it provides anonymity. So there goes the gender bias problems. It gives access to networks and finance, and it provides a flexible work environment. So one of the very tangible ways that the Government of Canada and the business community can contribute to inclusive growth is by encouraging Canadians to pursue e-commerce opportunities in Asia and to specifically focus on targeted initiatives that help encourage women entrepreneurs access to these markets. I'd like to now turn to the issue of the diaspora. As is true of women today, the talents and skills of Canada's diasporas and immigrants are not being used to their full potential. 20.6% of Canadians are foreign-born, much more than any other G7 country. The origins of many of these peoples come from Asia, the top three being the Philippines, India, and China. 25% of Canadians speak a language other than English or French. But to date, we just have not been particularly successful, in fully incorporating immigrants into our workplace. And many factors are at play, but one tangible area that could be addressed, and this comes from some of the work that the Foundation has been done, and I'm sure you've heard already in the last couple of days, is the tremendous impact that would be had if we could improve our foreign credential recognition. And that's not the only other area. Another promising area would be to develop programs that leverage the knowledge and skills that the diaspora community has to help them develop new Canadian business opportunities. And just one idea, and this actually is an idea that was originated in the U.S. International Diaspora Engagement Alliance, which you had brought my attention to, is that you support diaspora entrepreneurs who have robust startup ideas that they want to launch in their countries of origin. And this has been done in the context of Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America by the US. And there's no reason why Canada couldn't run a similar program in Asia. There are some other ideas, but I'll leave that if someone wants to ask a question about that. I'd like to end with some observations on initiatives that can be taken to ensure that our Indigenous population benefits from Canadian engagement with Asia. Now, the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board has estimated that if Aboriginal people and their businesses were better integrated into the Canadian economy, it could provide $27.8 billion of a boost to Canada's GDP. And as the economic importance of the Asia-Pacific grows, there are significant opportunities to use that growth to better integrate indigenous business by promoting economic partnerships with the First Nations. And I'm going to give you examples from two sectors, two concrete opportunities. That's in the tourism and in the energy sector. So Aboriginal tourism currently contributes about $1.4 billion annually to Canada's GDP. And by 2021, Aboriginal Tourism Canada hopes to grow this by $300 million and bring 50 new Aboriginal tourism companies online to export-ready status. And they're looking to Asian Pacific tourists to fuel much of that growth. And let me just give you some numbers. I mean, this is incredible. This past year, 122 million Chinese tourists traveled the world. Each spent about $900, which came up to a total of $109.8 billion. And that's only 10% of the Chinese population. Guess how many came to Canada? What percentage of that? You know, half a million, all right, which is nothing. So just imagine, and we also know that many of the Chinese tourists are fascinated by Aboriginal communities and are looking for opportunities for for tourism by Aboriginal companies. So just imagine the opportunities there for inclusive growth of those communities. And the second example is the energy sector. The British Columbia First Nations Energy and Mining Council says it fields numerous inquiries a day from Asia. With over 200 potential clean energy projects set to take place with First Nations involvement throughout the province, the opportunities for investment from Asia are tremendous. But the thing is that what we've also learned from the work that we do at the Asia Pacific Foundation is that a prerequisite for forming cross-Pacific relations that are beneficial to both sides is that we need to develop Aboriginal-related training and resources for Asian stakeholders. In other words, we have to work to provide competency, Aboriginal competency for potential Asian partners. Similarly, we have to provide that kind of Asia-related training for the Indigenous business leaders and their communities. And that's an area that the Asia Pacific Foundation is actually exploring now with a number of Aboriginal group partnerships. So, in conclusion, while economic growth is good, we know that it needs to be inclusive if Canadians are to support it. And if, as we move towards our engagement with Asia, we can foster equity within our country, particularly if we have carefully crafted policies and initiatives that promote opportunities for women entrepreneurs, for our diaspora, and for our Indigenous populations.
Thank you, Ava. It's giving us a number of common threads as we take a look at these. Things like e-commerce. We have other tools, training, and actually just connecting people in the diaspora. How?
Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You know, if this were a global value chain, most of the value added has been made already, and there's not a lot left for me to contribute to this product. But let me try in the spirit of the global value chain. Let me start by saying that this discussion around global trade and inclusiveness is of course an old debate. I remember, you know, studying in the 70s and the 80s, debates around growth and equity, and debates around whether or not countries that were outward oriented were more or less likely to pursue a path of economic development that was equitable, but measured in somewhat more narrow terms than we speak of today, measured just in terms of income and wealth distribution. And the conclusion back then, and I think it still holds true, is generally speaking, you know, openness is positive for equitable development, and autarky or inward-looking development strategies, generally speaking, are inimical to more equitable economic development. Fast forward 40 years, and that debate is still very relevant today, but we've added some layers to the question of equitable development with words such as the ones we're using today, which include inclusiveness and diversity. And inclusiveness, of course, goes much beyond income and wealth distribution, even though that's a very big part of it. And the thread I want to draw through the four discussions, presentations we've had, is we have to ask the prior question of what we mean by inclusiveness. Inclusiveness of what, and inclusiveness for whom? And depending on what your answer is to those two questions, the policy prescriptions could be quite different. You've already probably picked up that the different presenters here have talked about inclusiveness of different stakeholders, or participants, or constituents, whatever term you might want to use. Our colleague from Ottawa, describing the progressive trade agenda of the current government, is very focused on inclusiveness of women and SMEs. We heard from our colleague here talking about micro SMEs as a very important factor for inclusiveness. We heard from our colleague also the importance of resource exports and countries in Africa, for example, and other least developed countries, of the need to include them in global trade by allowing them to tap perhaps the only resource they have in order to climb the economic development ladder. And Dr. Busza here has added to the menu of inclusive candidates by talking about diaspora communities, of course, women again, immigrants, and not least Aboriginal communities. I would suggest to you that while there are commonalities among these different constituents and stakeholders, policy prescriptions may differ depending on which constituent you focus on. There's yet another dimension to inclusivity that has been touched on but really needs to be thought about a bit more deeply, which is the inclusivity of countries that were not part of the making of the modern global trading system. I think one of our colleagues talked about the role of Brazil and the BRIC countries essentially in trying to assert themselves more into what's called global governance. That is an inclusivity question as well. It's not one that we talk about much in Canada. And in fact, it's one that probably would create some controversy here, because essentially it's a question about how Brazil and South Africa and Indonesia and India and China want to have a bigger say in the rules of global trade, the rules of global governance, the rules of global finance. And the rules that they want to have may not be consistent with the values or the perceptions and the preconceptions that we have. So we're in a world where inclusivity is of course a catchword, and one that we need to think about very hard, but in itself it doesn't provide us with very simple answers. What I just want to end with, though, is to say that if there is a conclusion that I have reached in thinking about the debates I had 30, 40 years ago around growth and equity and how we are having the debate again, is that, as one of our colleagues said, international trade and exposure to international markets and outward-oriented development is not a panacea. It's not a guarantee either of growth or, even more importantly, a guarantee of equitable growth. And I think there's a policy consensus that's starting to develop, and Canada can be at the forefront of this, where we can, on the one hand, be very strong, passionate defenders of globalization and of the need for open markets and open capital flow, open product flows, and open, as far as possible, open human capital flows, and to some extent open capital flows, and yet be very strong defenders of large policy spaces domestically to regulate and to ensure that there are strong social safety nets. This is not the Washington consensus. The Washington consensus does not have the second part of what I talked about. It's more the Washington consensus meets the Beijing consensus. And we are in a position, I think, in this country to think deeply and maybe be a pathbreaker in reconciling the two approaches.
Thank you. That's actually an excellent summary. So we're open for some questions. We have space for a couple of questions here. Please.
Greetings. This microphone is on. I would like to bring us back to the previous plenary for a moment and just remind us that we have a climate crisis, issues relating to climate justice. To this end, there are concerns that growing the GDP is not a priority, and that production and extraction are CO2 greenhouse destructive initiatives. I would like, for the moment, to show a book which I picked up at a recent conference on the economics of happiness in Port Townsend, Fort Worden, Port Townsend a few weeks ago. There was a little area of Tibet which had been isolated from the rest of the world for a long time. It was prosperous and happy. They opened it to the outside world. It became unprosperous and very unhappy as sort of capitalistic philosophies strode through the country. To this end,
is there I just would say if you could focus the question.
The alternative is to think local production, local growth of food, etc. What I want to ask, therefore, is there some way that one can rationalize the idea of growing global trade for production of stuff that we have to advertise to get people to buy, versus thinking local and trying to preserve our environment for our children and grandchildren?
So is global trade destroying the environment? Is it counter to the sustainability?
Well, go ahead. I would say that as part of global trade, you also have the production of knowledge and the interchange of ideas. With global trade, car manufacturers that were otherwise, let's say, only in Germany or in Japan, are now located in Mexico, in Argentina, in parts of Canada, in parts of the United States. And when they come from one country to another, they train people, so there is knowledge, there is opportunity. And there are also, in some occasions, some negative effects as well. Not everything is the way we all would like it to be. But if the proposition I heard is one of, is opposite to openness, I don't think there are too many stories of success. You look at Cuba, you look at North Korea, and you ask the people of the world, would you like to come to live to Canada, or would you like to go and live in Cuba or North Korea? I would say most of the people would rather come to Canada, to the United States, and to other countries. And so that's the trade-off that is out there.
Any other comments?
I mean, just building on that, an important aspect of global trade is trade and services, which I think builds on your point, and that's not, trade and services need not be environmentally destructive. Furthermore, again, it's all, the devil is in the details, it's not in the extremes. So to the extent, and I think as the Senator was saying, to the extent that the policies that we adopt are ones that are carefully outlining the policy objectives so that we're trying to promote trade that is in clean technologies and services that promote clean technologies. That will be beneficial to all. And I think also, you know, there's been some very interesting studies historically of growth and poverty reduction. And we do see that while perhaps when we had agricultural societies, the opening was led to poverty alleviation. But with the level of development that we have across the world right now, actually the numbers show, the data shows that the openness is what improves and assists the increase in or the decrease in poverty across the mass. So, you know, these are all things that have to be balanced, and it's in the nuance of the policies.
I have to acknowledge that I'm not a business person and spent my career practicing medicine and doing research. But I thank you for your comments, and I think we're all just going to have to keep rethinking priorities. Thank you.
But I do have I do have one comment. If you look at Africa and you assess the quality of trade, what do you have in Africa? You have countries that are exporting basically raw material, extractive industries, energy. And the question is that good for Africa and for the African countries? The answer is no, because obviously when they have the Chinese so hungry for the raw material from Africa, it would have been so much better if you want to have the trickle-down effect on the economies, is that they would transform some of their produce and export it with some value added, the value added that will go and that will benefit the local population. So the quality of trade, I think, is extremely important. And when you look at diversification, I mean, obviously, if you just depend on 1 or 2 or 3 commodities, okay, you're not going to have the trickle-down effect, and you're not going to have the inclusiveness that you would have had if you've had diversification of your product mix that you export. So quality of trade is extremely important, and we have to emphasize that, and that's a very valid point.
Good point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Hugh Stevens, and my question relates to the digital economy and its impact on inclusivity and on global trade. So our panelists talked about, Dr. Busza talked, for example, about e-commerce and the avenues that it opens up. We've talked about MSMEs, and e-commerce is important for that. So I think one can accept that it does bring down barriers to the extent that everybody has access, but there's a kind of a contradiction, because at the same time, at least what I've observed, is that we have a tendency toward a winner-take-all kind of outcome for the digital world. I mean, how many Googles do we have? How many Facebooks do we have? We used to have MySpace. Facebook clobbered it. Alibaba was cited as an example, Amazon, and so on. And so on the one hand, we have the opening of the platform. On the other, we have the big getting bigger and basically accumulating increasing wealth into a smaller number of hands. And I just wonder if our panel could comment on the impact that the digital economy and the digital revolution is having for inclusivity. Thank you.
Well, this is what I was referring to when I talked about, on the one hand, one has to be open to the technological revolution that has allowed for the digital economy to improve our lives in many ways. I mean, how many of us can live without, Google Maps, for example, these days? But I think it's quite clear that the so-called network effects of digital economy, where the first movers with a lot of capital can essentially crowd out competition, not just crowd out, crush them, totally crush them, that it creates huge concentration of wealth, but more importantly, of power. And I think governments have to respond. There has to be some regulatory response that is commensurate with the concentration of power that is so encompassing. And we need to have conversations that treat the appropriate role of government regulation, probably intergovernmental regulation, that sees it as entirely consistent and appropriate with a liberalization agenda. This is not anti-liberalization, it's not anti-market, it's not anti-competitive. It's about making sure that the benefits of technological change go to the largest number of people and not to a small group of people.
We've seen that in the moves by the European Commission and
that's right.
Google particularly, and Microsoft. One more question and we'll have to call it, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, given that we've been speaking a lot at this conference about the new nation-to-nation relationship that we're hoping to build, and then it was mentioned by a couple of our panelists. I was wondering, this may be more specifically a question for Director General Usher, but if you could speak to the Indigenous involvement in Canada's progressive trade agenda.
Did you hear the question, David?
You'll have to take me off mute.
Did you hear the earlier question?
Excellent. Okay. I did hear the question. Yes. So they are being actively consulted in this area. As you may be aware, in the context of the NAFTA, we have proposed an Indigenous chapter, and I know that Minister Freeland is consulting on a regular basis with members of the Indigenous communities. This is not unique to the NAFTA, however, so that when we talk about investor agreements or trade agreements writ large, we normally retain protections for measures dedicated to support Indigenous communities, whether it's in the area of government procurement or, well, I guess it's principally trade and services or investment. So they are actively involved. I would argue that we're trying to do even more with them, both on the policy and the trade promotion side.
Thank you very much. So I think what you've heard today is, has global trade been of benefit? Yes. Has it been of benefit in all the ways we would hope it would be? No. Those who are plugged into the larger supply chains, particularly the enterprises that were geared for it, they've done well. But what we need to do is to get into maybe the micro SMEs, but certainly the SMEs. And this is a theme we've heard from several people on the panel. If we really do want to get diversity and inclusion, we've got to get to the SME level. But what we're hearing also is we have the tools. E-commerce may breed a few winners in certain areas, but on the other hand, it does provide a democratization of access to supply chains around the world and to global trade. So we've got the tools to do it. There's more work to be done, but this is something we'll pick up in some of the conversation tomorrow. So I'll do some advanced selling. Our session tomorrow at 10:30 on global trade and economic growth, we'll be exploring some of this. It's mistitled in the handbook, so I just wanted to tell you it's at 10:30 tomorrow. And with that, I would ask you to join me in thanking our excellent panelists.
Well, thank you. Thank you to the panel, the moderator, the organizers. Thank you to you, the participants. You've been great all day. You've taken it all in. I think today's rich conversation has certainly set the stage for a great exchange tomorrow, starting at 9 o'clock on economics of diversity, and we'll look into issues like diversity dividend and some recent studies that have been done on that. And then we'll break out in sessions over the course of the day. So looking forward to seeing you bright and early tomorrow morning. Shuttle leaves the conference center at 8 and 8:15, and a sharp 9 o'clock start here tomorrow morning. Looking forward to tomorrow's discussion and wishing everyone a good evening. Bonne soirée. Merci beaucoup et à bientôt.